In the frozen winter of 1953, a war veteran built a brick stove so massive the whole town called him crazy, until the night a blizzard nearly took everything. What happened next turned mockery into legend. If you believe some fires never die, hit subscribe and stay for stories that warm the soul. The wind rolled down from the northern hills of Wyoming, carrying the scent of winter and old regrets. It was November of 1953 when a man named Jack Halverson and his German Shepherd Bear came limping into the town of Ash Hollow. The truck looked like it had seen a war, and so did Jack. He was 52, the kind of man whose silence filled a room faster than words ever could. Bear was gray around the muzzle, one hind leg dragging just a little, a quiet echo of his owner's limp. They made an odd pair, like two soldiers still stuck in a battle the world had already forgotten. Jack Halvorsen. Jack Ward Halvorsen, as it said on the deed, bought a small patch of land just outside town, where the wind howled and the soil was too cold for crops. The cabin on it was a wreck half-roof, no door, and a chimney that leaned like it had given up. The realtor had looked at him twice as if waiting for him to change his mind. "You sure you want to live that far out?" She'd asked. Jack had simply nodded. Far's good. That first night, he and Bear slept beside a pile of firewood, the roof creaking above them. The wood stove hissed and popped, throwing light across Jack's scarred hands. "We made it, boy," he whispered. "Let's see if we can stay." Ash Hollow wasn't unkind, just cautious. The war had sent too many men back with ghosts, and Jack looked like a man who carried a battalion of them. Folks said he talked to his dog more than anyone else. "Heard him muttering at that mud again," the grocer said one morning. "Whole damn conversation." Another shrugged. "Hell, that dog's probably the only one who listens." Jack didn't mind. He fixed the roof, patched the walls, and built a small garden, even though everyone said nothing grew in that ground. When the nights turned cold, he'd sit beside the fire, one hand around a tin mug, the other resting on Bear's head. Sometimes his gaze would drift unfocused, like he was somewhere else, somewhere with siren smoke and dirt. In those moments, Bear would lift his head and nudge Jack's knee, grounding him back to the present. He'd smile, a faint flicker of life in those worn-out eyes. "Still here, huh?" "Yeah, me too." By late autumn, the nights stretched long and heavy. Jack could feel the cold creeping through the floorboards deeper each night like a warning. He started sketching something on the cabin floor with a piece of charcoal lines, shapes, measurements. Bear watched head, tilted tail flicking slowly. "It's gonna get bad this year," Jack said, as if Bear might argue. "Those old cast-iron stoves, they burn hot and die quick. I need something that holds heat, like the one I saw back in 44. He paused, his voice dropping softer. "Remember that boy. The bunker near Kursk. That old Russian. What was his name? Mikhail. Built a stove from clay and brick. Burned 2 hours a day and kept us alive." Bear made a low sound as if he remembered. Jack smiled, but his eyes were glassy distant. He didn't make it. But his fire did. The next morning, he went into town and bought every brick he could find, fire bricks, the kind used for kilns. The clerk looked puzzled. "You building a foundry or something?" Jack shook his head, just trying to keep warm. Over the next weeks, people noticed the strange delivery truck unloading pallets of red clay metal plates and bags of mortar. The gossip began. "He's lost his damn mind," one man said at the barber shop. "Building himself a tomb, I swear. Maybe it's therapy," another laughed. We all got our ways. Jack didn't respond to any of it. Each morning, he worked in silence. Each night, the hammering stopped when the stars came out and the coyotes began to cry. In those quiet hours, Bear would lie beside him, the two of them framed in the soft amber light of a single lantern. Sometimes, Jack would hum a melody, something old, something European, something you couldn't find on a jukebox. One evening, as the temperature fell to 10 below, the stove sputtered and died. Jack stared at it, then whispered to Bear, "Tomorrow we build something that remembers the fire." He reached for his notebook, the one he'd carried since the war, the edges worn thin. Inside were crude sketches, a chamber, a chimney, a flat platform. A bed made of heat. He looked up, smiled faintly. "We're not done fighting yet." The wind moaned outside, pressing against the cabin walls, but inside there was a strange stillness, a quiet before something extraordinary. Bear's eyes glowed in the dying firelight as Jack's pencil scratched across the paper. The outline of the stove, their salvation, was born in the middle of that frozen night. Winter came early that year, sharp and unkind. The first snow fell before Thanksgiving, coating the roofs of Ash Hollow in silence. For most people, that meant splitting firewood, patching leaks, and praying the old iron stoves would last another season. But Jack Halverson wasn't most people. While his neighbors were stacking cords of oak and pine, Jack was stacking something else entirely. Fire bricks heavy and red, each one set down with the precision of a man who'd built bridges under gunfire. He measured cut and checked his lines with the focus of an engineer. At first the townsfolk just watched. Curiosity was a kind of entertainment in a place that small. But as the pile of bricks grew taller inside his cabin, curiosity turned to laughter. "He's building a furnace big enough to roast himself in," said Earl Peterson, the feed store owner. "Man's out of his mind. Probably can't tell winter from war anymore." The rumor spread like kindling. "Crazy Jack's building his own coffin," someone said at the diner, and that phrase stuck. Coffin stove. The name followed him through every whispered conversation in town. Jack never argued. He just worked. Each morning he mixed mortar in a metal basin, a slow and careful rhythm. 3 parts sand, 1 part clay, stirred until it reached the texture he wanted, pliable. Not too dry, not too wet. It was a craft he'd learned decades earlier when bridges had to hold tanks instead of tractors. He placed the first course of bricks on a bed of stone, checking each joint with a carpenter's level. The wall rose an inch at a time. By the 3rd week it stood waist-high, by the 5th shoulder height. The sound of trowel against brick became a heartbeat inside that cabin. Bear never left his side. The dog's fur was often dusted in white mortar, his nose twitching at the scent of clay. When Jack worked late, Bear would rest his head on Jack's boot eyes, half-closed ears still listening. Sometimes in the hush between hammer strikes, Jack would speak to him softly. "They think I'm building a furnace, boy," he said one night, smearing mortar along a seam. "Guess they're not wrong. But it's not for burning things. It's for keeping something alive." Bear lifted his head-tail, tapping once against the floor. Jack smiled faintly. "Us," he added. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters like a ghost trying to get in. Inside, the structure took shape 8 inches thick, a belly of brick and steel, 6 channels coiling through it in looping S-shapes. When Jack built the flue system, he explained it to Bear as if teaching a class. "See this path here? Hot air travels up, across, down, back up again. It's not just a chimney, it's a maze. The heat gets lost on purpose, trapped until the bricks soak it in." He tapped a section of clay still drying. Thermal mass, they call it. Russians used it for centuries. The final piece was a wide, flat platform across the top, smooth as stone, perfectly level. That would be the leżanka, the sleeping platform where he and Bear would rest. It wasn't luxury. It was survival disguised as simplicity. He lined the firebox with cast-iron plates he'd scavenged from an old factory, each one polished by hand. The plates would take the brunt of the flame, transferring heat into the bricks like a slow heartbeat. Every decision came from memory, every movement deliberate. Jack's hands were cracked, the skin split from cold and mortar, but he didn't slow down. There was something sacred about the work, a rhythm only he and the dog understood. Neighbors came by to stare through the window. They saw the growing mound of brick, and the old soldier bent over it, and they shook their heads. "Ain't right," someone muttered. "Man should see a doctor." But when they left, Jack didn't watch them go. He kept working, whistling low under his breath, a tune Bear seemed to know. By early December, the stove filled half the cabin. Jack reinforced the floor with extra beams to bear the weight, nearly 3 tons of brick and clay. The air inside smelled of iron and dust. He spent hours checking the joints, scraping away imperfections, sealing the cracks with fine ash mortar. Each stroke of his trowel was a quiet defiance against the world outside. At night, when the cold crept through the chinks of the wall, he'd light a single candle and study his creation. Shadows from the brickwork danced along the ceiling, turning the cabin into something that felt alive. Bear would stretch across the floor snoring softly, his paws twitching as if chasing memories through snow. Jack would rest his hand on the dog's back and whisper, "Almost there, buddy. Just a little longer." The days bled together, brick, mortar silence. The laughter in town faded, replaced by the sound of wind and distant crows. And then, one morning, Jack stood back and looked at what he had built. The monster of brick and iron stood 7 feet tall, silent, waiting. His breath fogged in the cold air. He reached out, placed his hand against the cool surface, and smiled. "Now," he said quietly, "let's see if they were wrong." The third week of December came with silence thick enough to taste. The snow outside Jack's cabin lay untouched, a white shroud over the field. Inside, the half-finished stove loomed like a sleeping creature waiting for breath. Jack worked with his sleeves rolled up, the lantern light glinting off the sweat on his temples. Bear sat near the door, his head resting on his paws, eyes following every move his master made. That night, just as Jack was setting a final row of bricks, there was a knock on the window light, hesitant. When he turned, he saw a small face pressed against the glass pink from the cold. Jack opened the door and found Owen, the neighbor's boy, no older than 10, holding a flashlight and curiosity in equal measure. "You shouldn't be out this late, kid." Jack said, his voice low but not unkind. Owen shuffled his boots in the snow. "Mom says you're building something weird. Can I see it?" Jack hesitated, then stepped aside. The boy entered, eyes wide, as he stared at the towering structure in the middle of the room. "Why is it so big?" he asked. Jack's trowel paused mid-air. He looked at the boy for a long time before answering. "Because cold kills slow," he said softly. "I've seen that before." The words hung heavy between them. The boy frowned. How can cold kill Jack? Knelt beside him, his knees creaking. The firelight caught the lines on his face, deep as scars. "Not like a bullet," he said. "It doesn't shout or bleed. It just takes a little piece of you each night until there's nothing left that remembers warmth." Owen's flashlight flickered as if reacting to his tone. "Where'd you see that?" the boy asked. "Europe," he murmured. "Winter of '44. We were stuck behind the front line, no fire, no shelter, just ice and smoke. I met a Russian soldier, older than I am now. He built a stove out of mud and brick, no bigger than this table. Said he'd learned it from his grandfather in Siberia. He smiled faintly, but his eyes were distant. He burned wood for 2 hours a day. The fire would die, but the heat stayed. All night. It felt like sleeping inside a heartbeat." Owen sat cross-legged on the floor, listening as if to a campfire story. "Did it save you?" he asked. Jack nodded. "It saved me. Him not so much." He froze on a scouting run 2 days later. The boy looked down. "I'm sorry." Jack shook his head slowly. He knew what he was doing. Before he left, he told me something. He said, "We don't fight the cold. We teach it how to live with us." I didn't understand it then. His eyes softened. Maybe I do now. For a moment, neither spoke. The stove's shadow flickered against the walls, moving like a memory, trying to stay alive. Bear stirred, letting out a soft whine. Jack reached over and rubbed the dog's head. "He was there too," he said to Owen. "Same winter, same fight." The boy reached out, petting Bear's fur with gentle fingers. "He's old," Owen said. "So am I," Jack replied, smiling a little. We both creak in the cold. Owen looked up at the massive brick structure again. "Will it really stay warm all night?" Jack wiped his hands on a rag. "That's the plan. Heat that lingers even when the fire's gone." The boy studied it thoughtfully. "Mom says you don't talk to anyone." Jack chuckled. "She's not wrong. Talking doesn't always help. Building does." He handed Owen a spare brick. "Here, feel it." The boy weighed it in his small hands. "It's heavy, that's the point," Jack said. "It's supposed to hold something, like heat, like memories." Owen frowned but didn't ask more. The room smelled of clay and wood smoke. The lantern flickered as a gust of wind rattled the windows. "You better head home," Jack said. "Your mom will worry." Owen hesitated, then nodded. Before he left, he turned and asked, "Can I tell her what you said about the cold?" Jack smiled. "You can tell her anything you want, kid." When the boy was gone, Jack stood by the door for a long moment, listening to the crunch of his footsteps fade into the night. He turned back to the stove, touching the cool surface of the bricks. "He reminds me of someone," he murmured. Bear tilted his head as if asking who. A boy from the village near Kursk, Jack whispered. "Used to follow us around, carrying coal for the stove. Always cold, always smiling." He trailed off, staring into the flicker of the lantern flame. The cabin was quiet except for the wind pressing against the walls and the steady breathing of the dog. The next morning, word spread fast. Owen had told his parents, who told others. At the diner, people laughed. "He's telling war stories to kids now," someone said. "Poor old guy can't tell past from present." Another nodded. "Haunted, that's what he is. Haunted by ghosts that ain't real." The laughter came easily, as gossip does when it keeps people warm. But inside the cabin at the edge of town, Jack didn't hear it. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. He set another row of bricks, whistled a tune he barely remembered, and kept building. Bear watched quietly, his eyes reflecting the flame as if he too saw ghosts dancing inside the fire. By mid-December, winter came down like a curtain, quiet but absolute. The first snow didn't fall gently. It arrived with the authority of something ancient blanketing Ash Hollow in white silence that seemed to muffle even time. The thermometer on Jack's porch read 10 below, a warning of a season meant to test the living. In town, smoke rose from every chimney, dark columns twisting in the gray. People were already burning through their woodpiles faster than they'd planned. The nights were long, the air heavy with the tang of smoke and creosote. But on the outskirts in the little cabin by the frozen creek, there was only a thin ribbon of smoke in the morning, and none at all after noon. Inside, the warmth held steady. Jack had finished sealing the last seams of mortar 2 days before. The stove stood complete, its body of brick humming faintly with stored heat. That morning, he had lit it for the first time. Just 14 pounds of oak burned in a clean roaring blaze that lasted 2 hours. He'd watched the flames dance behind the iron grate, the heat threading through 6 channels inside the brick maze he had built by hand. Then he'd closed the damper, shut the iron door, and waited. By evening, the house still breathed warmth, soft and constant, like a living creature. The air was dry, but not brittle. The walls no longer wept cold. Bear had claimed his place atop the Lezhanka, the wide brick platform that stayed as warm as sunlight on stone. He lay sprawled across it, his chest rising and falling in rhythm, one paw twitching as if he were chasing something pleasant in his dreams. Jack sat beside him, a book open in his hands, though his eyes wandered more than they read. He turned a page, the paper warm to the touch. For the first time since moving to Ash Hollow, his fingers didn't sting from the cold. "We did it, boy," he murmured. "We made something that remembers." Bear's ear flicked, acknowledging him without waking. Outside, the wind scraped across the cabin walls, whispering threats it could no longer keep. The sound of it used to make Jack's shoulders tense, a reflex from nights spent under canvas and snowdrifts waiting for things that never came. Now, it only reminded him how small the world was when you had heat and silence. The knock came just after dusk. 3 soft raps, hesitant. Jack set the book aside and opened the door to find Owen bundled in a coat too big for him, his breath hanging in white clouds. "Mom said not to come, but I wanted to see it," the boy said quickly. Jack stepped back to let him in. The boy blinked, stepping into the cabin as if he'd entered another world. "It's warm," he said, surprise widening his eyes. "But there's no fire." Jack smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "The fire's still here," he said, laying his hand on the brick wall. "It just stopped screaming." Owen placed his small hand next to Jack's. The brick was hot, not burning, but alive. How, he asked. "The bricks remember," Jack said simply. "They hold what we give them. That's what most folks forget about heat. It's not about how bright it burns. It's about how long it stays." The boy stared at the wall as though it might breathe. "Does it ever go out?" Everything goes out, Jack replied quietly. The trick is making it take its time. Owen looked around his eyes, catching the light from the oil lamp. It's like summer in here, he said, half in awe. Jack chuckled softly. Then don't tell your mother or the whole town will move in. The boy laughed, the sound small and bright. He walked over to Bear, who cracked one eye open, sniffed the boy's glove and sighed before closing it again. He likes it too, Owen said. He earned it, Jack replied. He was there for every brick. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. The warmth filled the gaps between words. Owen eventually spoke, his voice low. The kids at school said you were crazy, said you were building a house for ghosts. Jack's smile faded, but his tone didn't change. Maybe I was. Maybe the kind that keep you warm instead of cold. The boy frowned, trying to understand. Jack didn't explain. Some truths weren't meant to be told in full, especially to those still learning the weight of winters. Outside, the snow deepened. The oil lamp flickered and the stove exhaled another long, invisible breath of heat. Jack stood and pulled down the curtain over the window. You'd better go before it gets too dark, he said. The snow hides the road. Owen nodded reluctantly. Can I come back tomorrow? Jack's lips curved. If your mother doesn't mind. When the boy left, Jack lingered at the door, watching the small figure make its way through the falling snow, each footprint glowing faintly in the lantern light. He closed the door and turned back toward the stove. The brick glowed softly in the lamplight. Its surface warmed the air around it, steady and calm. Bear yawned, stretching before curling up again. Jack lowered himself beside the dog, resting his back against the bricks. The warmth seeped through his coat, through his scars, into the places he never thought could feel anything again. He exhaled slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting as the world outside howled. The cold might have been endless, but for the first time in years he knew it couldn't reach them anymore. The last week of December arrived like a punishment. On the 28th, the wind began before dawn, a low moan that grew into a roar as the day darkened. By afternoon, the horizon had vanished entirely. The sky was white, the ground was white, and the air between was a river of frozen knives. The storm swept across Wyoming with the fury of something ancient, something that didn't care who remembered its last visit 30 years before. Ash Hollow disappeared under it in a single day. The wind clawed at doors and windows, gusting past 40 miles an hour. Snow packed against the houses until roofs sagged. The temperature dropped to 30 below, then lower. People huddled in their homes, burning wood faster than they could split it. The black smoke from 100 chimneys bent sideways in the gale, twisting like ghosts fleeing into the cold. Inside Jack Halverson's cabin, the storm was only a whisper against thick log walls. He'd already lit his morning fire before sunrise, 20 pounds of oak split fine and dry. For 2 hours it burned clean and bright, feeding heat into the maze of brick. When the flames settled to ash, Jack closed the iron damper, sealing in the warmth. By noon the wind howled like the ocean, but inside his home the air was calm. The temperature held at 70 degrees. He sat at the table, oil lamp flickering beside him. Bear sprawled across the lejanka, snoring softly, nose twitching in dreams. Occasionally, a gust would rattle the windows and Jack would glance up, remembering nights when wind meant artillery and the air tasted of iron. He took a slow breath. The stove's low hum felt like life itself, survival earned through patience. Out beyond the glass, nothing moved. The world was a white void. Hours passed without measure. Jack checked the firebox once more out of habit than need. The brick was hot to the touch, steady as a pulse. Bear shifted, rolling onto his back, a paw raised midair as if even his dreams had grown warm. Jack smiled faintly. "You've got it, good boy," he said, the words quiet, nearly lost under the moaning wind. He poured himself coffee and watched the lamplight shimmer on the surface. He thought of Owen and his mother, their small house just 200 meters down the slope. He'd helped them patch the roof last summer, noticed how the walls leaked cold through every crack. They had one of those small cast-iron stoves, good for cooking, terrible for surviving this. He wondered if they had enough wood stacked. He considered checking, then looked at Bear, "Tomorrow," he said aloud, "when the wind slows." But the wind didn't slow. It built and built until it sounded like the world itself was tearing apart. In town, power lines snapped, poles fell, and lights blinked out one by one. The telegraph cables froze solid and broke under their own weight. Roads vanished beneath 6-foot drifts. By nightfall, Ash Hollow was silent except for the storm. Families gathered near their stoves, feeding them until the iron glowed red, but the heat barely reached beyond arm's length. Cold seeped through the walls, through the floor, through the spaces between words spoken in fear. Some stoves cracked under the strain metal, splitting with sharp, sudden bangs. Sparks leapt across rooms. Jack couldn't hear any of it, but maybe Bear could. The dog's ears twitched once, then settled again. Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind wandering. He thought of that Russian soldier again, the way he'd tended his little clay stove like a prayer. 2 hours a day, the man had said. Enough to live. Jack had never understood the reverence in his voice until now. He looked toward his own stove, the glow from the brick painting the room in a soft amber tone. The air was warm, gentle against his skin. "You were right, Mikhail," he whispered. "You don't fight the cold. You make peace with it." Outside, the storm intensified. Snow hit the windows with the sound of thrown sand. In the distance, unseen through the blinding white, a small house trembled under the weight of the wind. Inside that house, Mrs. Turner threw more wood into their iron stove, but the air still stung their lungs. The fire hissed angrily, heat trapped in the metal box, too hot, too fast. She tried closing the damper, but the flue was already glowing. When the backplate cracked, the sound was sharp enough to make her drop the poker. Smoke poured into the room, thick and suffocating. She shouted for Owen, but the words vanished into the gray. The boy stumbled toward her, coughing, eyes watering. The air grew darker, choking heavy with the taste of carbon and fear. She reached for the door, but the wind slammed it shut. The window panes turned black. Her last sight was her son's pale face disappearing in the haze. The storm outside devoured everything, the wind screaming against the walls. 200 meters uphill, Jack caught the sharp smell of smoke on the wind, faint but certain. Bear's head lifted, ears pricked. The dog whined once, low and uneasy. Jack looked toward the window, but all he saw was the snow, endless, thick, and wild. He rose slowly, setting down his cup. "What is it, boy?" he asked. Bear was already standing, body tense, nose pointed toward the door. The fur along his back bristled. Jack moved to the window, pressed his palm to the cold glass. There was no light from the valley. Not a single flicker. Only white. He frowned, a chill not from temperature crawling up his spine. The wind banged against the shutters, demanding to be heard. Bear barked once, sharp and certain, and then turned toward the door, tail rigid, waiting for command. The wind was still howling when Bear barked again, short, urgent, the kind of sound that carried instinct older than reason. Jack turned from the window. "Easy, boy," he said, but the dog wouldn't calm. Bear ran to the door, pawing at it, whining, then darting back to Jack, tugging at his coat sleeve with his teeth. "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice steady, though his gut had already turned cold. Then he smelled it, faint but certain, the acrid bite of smoke cutting through the frozen air. Jack moved fast. He grabbed his old army coat from the hook by the stove, the same one that had followed him across Europe. The fabric was worn thin, but the habit of command was still alive in his bones. "All right, Bear," he said, pulling the heavy coat tight and fastening the buckle of his belt. Led the way. He took a rope from a nail on the wall, looped one end around his waist, the other around the dog's harness. The air that hit him when he opened the door was like a wall of glass shards. The storm screamed, filling his ears, stinging his face until his skin went numb. Snow whipped sideways, burying his boots instantly. "Go!" he shouted. And Bear lunged forward, nose, low, tail, straight muscles cutting through the drifts with the precision of memory. Jack followed, leaning against the wind, each step a fight. The snow was up to his knees, then his thighs. His breath froze on his scarf, turning it to ice. The rope jerked as Bear pulled ahead, the dog driven by something primal, a scent, A sound, maybe both. Through the white chaos, a shape finally emerged, the outline of the small house down the hill. Jack could barely see the roof under the snow. The chimney was dark, no smoke rising. Then, in the next flash of lightning, he saw it black streaks pouring from a crack along the wall. Smoke. "Hang on, kid," Jack muttered, pushing harder. They reached the porch, nearly buried under snow. The front door was jammed. He kicked it once, twice, then threw his shoulder against it until the frame cracked open. A gust of smoke burst out, choking, burning his throat. He ducked low, wrapping his scarf over his mouth. "Owen," he shouted, voice muffled. "Mrs. Turner?" No answer. Just the hiss of a dying fire and the groan of the wind trying to get in. He crouched lower and moved forward, one hand on Bear's harness. The dog led him straight through the smoke toward the back of the room. There they were, Owen and his mother, collapsed beside the iron stove, faces gray, still breathing, but shallow. "Good boy," Jack said, coughing. "Good boy." He knelt, lifted the woman onto his shoulder with practiced motion, the old soldier's strength returning like muscle memory. "Can you take him, Bear?" The dog whined once, then nudged Owen's arm, gripping his jacket sleeve gently and tugging. "Easy," Jack said. "We'll get them home." Outside, the world was still nothing but white and noise. The wind drove snow into their eyes, their mouths, their clothes. Jack staggered under the weight, every step sinking deep. The rope between them stretched taut. "Keep going," he shouted, voice raw. Bear pressed forward, small bursts of movement cutting through the drift. The boy's weight dragged against him, but he didn't slow. Jack's lungs burned, his legs ached with the strain. The cabin lights had vanished behind the snow, but Bear never wavered. He seemed to know the path, even blind. When Jack's boot caught on a buried root and he stumbled, Bear barked sharply and pulled, refusing to stop until Jack regained his footing. "I'm with you," Jack gasped. "Keep it up, boy." It felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. When the shadow of his cabin finally appeared through the storm, Jack almost didn't believe it was real. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stumbled inside, the sudden stillness hitting him like mercy. He lowered Mrs. Turner onto the floor beside the stove. Bear dragged Owen gently toward the Lejanka, whining, nudging him until his head rested on the warm bricks. Jack knelt beside them, fingers trembling as he checked for breath. Both were shallow but alive. The color of their skin was pale gray, but warmth was already touching them, slow and invisible. Jack looked at the stove. The surface glowed faintly, heat radiating from deep within its core. He unwrapped his scarf, gasping lungs burning from smoke and cold. Bear collapsed beside Owen, sides heaving, steam rising off his fur. Jack laid a blanket over them, then fetched another for the woman. The warmth seeped through the fabric almost instantly. He leaned his palm against the Lejanka and felt the steady pulse of heat. His voice came low, almost reverent. "Now, fire," he whispered, "it's your turn." The bricks under his hand seemed to hum. The air thickened with warmth, gentle but strong, pushing the cold back inch by inch. Jack moved quickly, hot water cloths, steady breathing. Bear didn't move, eyes half closed, but alert, watching over the boy as though guarding something sacred. The storm outside raged on, clawing at the windows, but the sound couldn't reach them here. In the heart of that frozen night, the old soldier and his dog worked in silence, warmed by the fire that no longer needed to burn. The storm did not stop. For 3 days and nights it roared across the plains like a living thing, devouring fences, bending trees, and burying the world in silence. The snow piled against Jack's cabin until the windows were nothing but faint gray shadows. Inside, time dissolved. There was no day, no night. Only the sound of wind pressing against the walls and the faint, constant warmth that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The stove held steady, its heat deep and calm like a giant heart beating beneath the floorboards. Jack moved carefully, conserving every motion. He gave the last of the soup to Mrs. Turner on the first night, spooning it slowly while she drifted in and out of consciousness. Her skin had color again by morning. Owen slept fitfully, his small body trembling less each hour. Bear stayed beside him, his thick coat rising and falling with each steady breath. When Owen stirred and whimpered in his sleep, Bear would lift his head, press his muzzle to the boy's cheek, and settle again. Jack watched them with quiet gratitude. "Good boy," he murmured, voice hoarse. The wind outside shrieked in answer as if angry that something still lived. Food grew scarce, but Jack divided what he had with a soldier's precision. 1 piece of bread, 3 bites each. Bear always last. He broke the loaf into uneven fragments, placed one near the dog's paws. "You earned it," he said softly. Bear sniffed it once, then pushed it toward Owen with his nose. Jack smiled faintly, a crease of light in his tired face. "Still giving? Huh," he whispered. "Some habits never die." The heat from the stove was constant, gentle enough that the air didn't dry the throat. It was a miracle of patience, not flame. Jack checked the damper once every 12 hours just to be sure. When he opened the small iron door, the faint glow of embers still lived inside, quiet and obedient. He adjusted nothing. The warmth stayed as it was steady, faithful, alive. The nights were the hardest. The storm grew louder after sunset, and the roof groaned under the weight of snow. Jack lay awake in his chair, every muscle taut, listening for cracks or shifts. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by the whine of the wind and the sound of Bear's breathing. On the second night, Mrs. Turner finally opened her eyes fully. She tried to speak, but her throat caught. Jack poured her a cup of water, held it for her to sip. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Don't try to talk." She looked around the cabin, confusion flickering in her eyes. "The boy," she managed. Jack pointed toward the stove. Owen slept against the lezhanka, his head resting on Bear's chest. The dog's tail moved weakly at the sound of his name, a faint thump against the blanket. "He's warm," Jack said. "You both are." She nodded, once tears pooling before she drifted back into sleep. Jack sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the two of them. The firelight played along the bricks, turning the surface gold. He reached out, pressed his palm against it, feeling the warmth pulse beneath. "Mikhail," he whispered, eyes closed. "You'd like this old man." He could almost hear the Russian's voice again, deep, steady, patient, talking about how fire wasn't just heat but memory, how it carried something of the people who built it. Jack had thought it superstition back then, a story for cold nights. But now, sitting there in the heart of a storm, he understood. The stove was alive because it remembered. It remembered every hand that had shaped it, every breath that had worked beside it, every hour that had fought against the dark. On the third day, the bread was gone. The wind had not lessened, but the sound had changed. It no longer screamed, only sighed as if it too was growing tired. Jack's face was red from cold, and smoke his eyes, swollen skin raw from the dry air. Still, he rose every few hours to check on the others, covering them with extra blankets, moving water closer to the warmth so it wouldn't freeze. He fed Bear the last bit of dried meat from the cupboard. The dog took it but didn't eat right away, staring at Jack instead, tail brushing the floor once. "Go on," Jack said. "You've done enough." Bear waited, then finally swallowed it, licking his muzzle and curling tighter against Owen. Jack leaned against the wall beside the stove. His body begged for rest, but habit kept him half awake. He turned his head toward the platform. Owen was breathing steadily now, his skin pink from warmth. Bear's head rested on the boy's chest, rising and falling in unison. Jack smiled faintly, exhaustion softening his features. "Good boy," he whispered again, his voice almost gone. The dog didn't move, just exhaled a long, slow breath that sounded like contentment. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, the rhythm of their breathing blending with the soft hum of the stove. The wind outside still clawed at the cabin, but inside it was different. The warmth wasn't just heat anymore, it was something deeper, something that felt like a heartbeat shared among 4 souls who refused to be taken by the cold. When the wind finally died, it did not end with a shout, but with a sigh. The morning after the third night. The storm had spent itself, leaving behind a world unrecognizable beneath its white shroud. The cabin walls no longer shook, and the snow on the roof settled like a sleeping animal. Inside, the air was still warm, steady, even alive. Jack opened his eyes to a dim gray light filtering through the cracks of snow-caked windows. For a moment he didn't move, The rhythm of Owen's breathing, faint but even, filled the room. Mrs. Turner stirred softly under the blankets, her face flushed with color. Bear lifted his head, ears twitching, eyes bright despite the exhaustion in his bones. "Morning, boy," Jack whispered, his voice cracked from dryness. Bear blinked, then laid his head back on Owen's chest, sighing. Jack pushed himself up from the chair joint, stiff, and moved toward the stove. He pressed his palm against the brick, still warm, still holding its quiet heartbeat. The thermometer on the wall read 68 degrees, though the air outside was 20 below. He smiled faintly, a kind of disbelief mixed with gratitude. Outside, somewhere far away, came the sound of engines, vehicles struggling through the snow. Jack pulled on his coat and opened the door cautiously. The air hit him sharp and bright but calm. The sky was pale blue, streaked with sunlight. In the distance, he could see movement figures wading through the drifts, dark against the blinding white. Search teams. He stepped outside, raising his hand. One of the men pointed toward him, shouting something lost in the distance. Within half an hour, the first rescuers reached the cabin. They were coated in frost, faces red from cold. "You all right in there?" one of them called out. "We've been checking every house. No one's got heat left." Jack nodded. "We're fine," he said simply. When they stepped inside, they stopped short. The warmth hit them first, a wave of comfort, so sudden it felt impossible. Steam rose faintly from their coats. "How in God's name?" one whispered, taking off his gloves. "It's warm. It's actually warm." The others looked around, astonished. The stove dominated the small room, a monolith of brick and steel, glowing faintly in the morning light. Its surface radiated calm heat, the kind that seeps into the skin and lingers in the bones. Dr. Miller, the town physician, was among them. He crouched near Owen, checked his pulse, then turned to Jack. "He's recovering," he said. "You saved his life." Jack shook his head. "We both did," he replied, nodding toward Bear. The doctor smiled faintly. "Then the three of you saved each other." Mrs. Turner stirred, eyes blinking open. Her gaze found her son first, then Jack. Her lips trembled. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think we'd make it." Jack didn't answer. He just adjusted her blanket and stood back, his hand resting lightly on the stove, as though grounding himself. Dr. Miller walked to the brick structure, laid his palm against it, and frowned in disbelief. "You haven't added wood since when 4 days," Jack said quietly. The doctor blinked. 4 days, and it's still 68 in here." He glanced at the thermometer, then back at Jack. "How?" Jack gave a small shrug. "It remembers heat, fire, maybe something else too." The rescuers exchanged looks but said nothing. One of them removed his hat, rubbing his hands together near the wall. "Warmest place I've been all week," he murmured. Owen shifted, eyes fluttering open. Jack leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Easy there, son." The boy blinked up at him, confusion giving way to recognition. "You built this," Owen whispered. "To save people, didn't you?" Jack hesitated, the question hanging in the still air. He looked at the boy's hand, clutching his own, small and fragile. His eyes softened. "No, son," he said quietly. "I built it because I didn't know how to save myself." The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, warm, heavy with meaning. Dr. Miller glanced down, his throat tightening. Bear gave a soft whine, shifting his weight closer to Owen, pressing his nose against the boy's wrist as if to reassure himself that life had returned. Outside, the rescuers began clearing snow from the doorway, voices rising in relief. Someone called out that the road had opened halfway to town. Jack stepped into the light spilling through the open door. The sun caught on the frost crystals in the air, scattering them like glass dust. The valley below was silent except for the distant echo of engines. Smoke rose from only one chimney, theirs. A thin column, calm and straight, reaching toward the clear sky. Behind him, he could hear Dr. Miller speaking quietly to another rescuer. The others, their stoves went cold, every single one. But this thing still holding steady. What kind of stove is it? Someone asked. Miller shook his head slowly. The kind built by a man who refused to die. Jack turned slightly at the words, looking back toward the Lezhanka, where Owen now sat upright, smiling weakly. and Bear lay still beside him watching. For the first time in days, the air inside smelled not of smoke or fear, but of bread warming in the heat and snow melting from boots. Outside, the storm's destruction glittered in sunlight, but inside, life had already started again, pulsing from the heart of a silent fire that refused to fade. When spring came to Ash Hollow, it did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, hesitant like a guest unsure if it was welcome after the long winter. The snow melted in streaks, carving narrow rivers through the fields, carrying with it the memory of a storm that had tested every soul in town. The roads reopened, the air lost its bite, and life began to move again, but something in the town had changed. The people no longer spoke of Crazy Jack with mockery. Now, when they saw him walking down Main Street, his old coat patched at the elbows and Bear limping faithfully beside him, they nodded with quiet respect. They all knew what had happened in the storm, how his fire had survived when every other flame had died. It wasn't just luck, they said it was knowledge, it was craft, it was something older than any of them had ever bothered to understand. The story spread faster than the thaw. Within weeks, neighbors began stopping by his cabin, asking questions in voices that carried both humility and hope. Could he show them how he'd built it? Could they make one too? Jack didn't answer right away. He listened, studied their faces, and saw what the winter had left behind, fear, yes, but also a new kind of hunger. Not for warmth, but for understanding. One morning, he finally nodded. "All right," he said, "but you'll build it with your own hands." And so, through that spring and into summer, Jack Halverson, the man once called Mad, became the teacher of a quiet revolution. He helped 3 families, first the Millers, the Dawsons, and the Carmans. Each home had its own challenges, its own walls that needed reinforcement, its own lessons learned from trial and error. Jack didn't rush. He taught them to mix the clay slowly, the way the Russian soldier had shown him decades ago. 3 parts sand, 1 part clay, and water, until it felt alive between the fingers. If you rush the mortar, he told them, it cracks when the cold comes. He measured every brick placement by eye, tapped them twice to seat them just right, and taught each family how to listen to the sound it made. A hollow sound means trouble, he'd say. A solid one means it'll hold the heat. When each stove was finished, Jack insisted on one final step. Beneath the last brick, he pressed his thumb into the clay and traced a small line of words with a nail before sealing it in. Heat remembers kindness. He said nothing of it aloud, but the families knew. They'd seen what kindness had done that winter. By midsummer, the people of Ash Hollow had given his invention a name. They called it the Ward Stove, borrowing from the middle name few had known he had, Jack Ward Halverson. Ward, they said, meant guardian protector, the one who kept the cold at bay. The name stuck. The town's carpenter even painted a sign for him, Ward Stove Designs, built to remember. Jack hung it crookedly above his workshop window and never bothered to straighten it. Bear stayed close during those long days of work. His limp had grown more noticeable, but his spirit hadn't dimmed. He still followed Jack through every pile of clay and brick, nose-dusted white tail wagging faintly, as if keeping time with the rhythm of trowel against stone. Sometimes, when the sun dropped low and the shadows stretched across the fields, Owen would appear at the edge of the path. He came almost every evening now, bringing small gifts, a loaf of bread from his mother, a few nails from his father's shed, or just questions. Jack would hand him a trowel and point toward the clay. "You want to learn?" he'd ask. Owen always nodded. Together, they worked in the yard behind the cabin, the smell of wet earth filling the air. Bear watched from the porch tail, brushing the wood in slow, contented beats. Jack showed the boy how to mix mortar by hand, how to feel the texture change as it thickened, how to listen to the sound when a brick was set just right. "It's not about fire," he said one evening, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's about patience. The heat will come, but only if you give it time to find its way." Owen nodded, repeating the words softly as though afraid they might escape. Jack smiled, the lines at his eyes deepening. "Remember that," he said, "not just for stoves." As the weeks passed, more people came to watch the curious, the cautious, the ones who'd once laughed. They stood quietly now, taking notes, asking questions, offering help. The rhythm of building became the rhythm of healing. Jack would light his pipe on the porch while the sun sank behind the hills, Bear resting at his feet. Owen stacking leftover bricks with careful hands. Sometimes Jack would glance toward the horizon where the wind moved gently through the grass, and he'd think of that soldier in the bunker of the words that had followed him through decades and across oceans. He'd whisper them again, mostly to himself. We don't fight the cold. We teach it how to live with us. Bear would lift his head at the sound ears twitching, and Jack would reach down, scratching behind them. You taught me that, too, didn't you, old boy? The dog leaned into his hand-eyes, bright and knowing. And in that small corner of Wyoming, under skies that once carried storms, warmth became more than survival. It became a language passed from hand to hand, brick to brick, heart to heart. The years passed softly in Ash Hollow, the way time does when a place has already seen its fiercest storms. The winters came and went, some kind, some cruel, but none ever as merciless as that one long ago. People still talked about it sometimes, how the snow buried half the town, how one old soldier and his dog had kept the fire alive when the world froze. They said his stove changed everything, that it made the cold something to live with instead of fight. But to Jack Halverson, the years that followed were not about memory. They were about keeping something steady. By 1958, he had grown thin and gray, his back slightly bent, his hands slower, but his eyes still sharp. His cabin, once the loneliest in the valley, now stood as a quiet monument, its chimney sending up a thin ribbon of smoke each winter morning. The sign above the window had faded, but you could still make out the words, Ward Stove Designs, built to remember. Bear, now an old dog with a white muzzle, and a limp that never healed quite right, lay curled at Jack's feet by the stove. His breathing was slow but steady, the rhythm of a creature who had earned his rest. Outside, snow fell again, soft, heavy flakes drifting down like forgotten letters. The world was quiet, except for the faint crackle of embers deep inside the stove. The Lezhanka still held its warmth the same way it had 10 winters before. Jack sat in his chair beside it, a wool blanket over his knees, staring at the glow of the brick. He ran his hand over its surface, feeling the same smoothness, the same heartbeat of heat. Still keeps warm, huh, came a voice from the doorway. Jack turned slow but smiling. Owen stood there taller now, his face carrying the calm confidence of a man who had built things that lasted. The boy who once asked questions had become an engineer, his hands rough, his eyes bright. Jack gestured for him to come closer. You found your way back, he said. Couldn't stay away forever, Owen replied, setting down his gloves. Figured I owed a visit to the man who taught me to listen to bricks. Jack chuckled softly. They don't talk to everyone. Maybe I just learned from the best. Owen crouched near the stove, pressing his palm against the brick as Jack once had. Still 68, I bet. Still 68, Jack confirmed. Owen's gaze softened as he looked around the room at the wooden beams darkened by smoke at the tools still neatly arranged on the wall. You know, he said, I built one of these in Montana. Different materials, but same idea. I called it the Ward model. People say it saves twice the wood and feels like sleeping under the sun. Jack's smile was faint proud. That's good, son. You took it further than I ever could. I only followed your design. No, Jack said gently, you followed the lesson. Owen looked at him puzzled. Which lesson? Jack nodded toward the stove. Patience. Same thing I told you back then. Fire's easy. Keeping it steady, that's the hard part. Bear lifted his head at the sound of Jack's voice, his cloudy eyes searching. Jack reached down and stroked his fur slow, gentle, reverent. He taught me how to build it right, he said, voice almost a whisper. Didn't you, boy? Bear gave a soft bark, little more than a breath of sound, then rested his head on Jack's foot. Owen smiled quietly, the corners of his eyes damp from the heat and maybe something else. He's still guarding it, he said. He always did, Jack replied, long before I understood why. The snow thickened outside, pressing against the windows like a soft white curtain. The light in the room turned golden from the stove's glow, casting slow-moving shadows on the walls. Jack leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of warmth filling the cabin. "Funny," he murmured. "When I built this thing, I thought I was fighting the cold, but it wasn't the cold that scared me. It was forgetting what warmth felt like." Owen didn't answer. He only sat there, the quiet between them fuller than any words could be. Bear's breathing grew slower, heavier, until it matched the rhythm of the fire's faint hiss. Outside, the wind began to rise again, but it was gentle this time, brushing against the cabin without malice. Jack opened his eyes, looked at Owen, and gave a small nod. "You'll keep building them, won't you, as long as people need them?" Owen said. Jack's lips curved. "Then it'll never be cold again." He looked down at Bear, whose eyes fluttered as though caught in a dream. The old dog's tail moved once, twice, then stilled in peace. Jack placed his hand on the brick once more, palm-flat eyes glimmering in the stove's glow. The words carved beneath the final brick echoed quietly in his mind. Words that had followed him through warstorm and age. Built not to fight the cold, but to remember warmth. The camera would linger there on the soft dance of the light, the steady hum of the stove, and the stillness of two old souls who had kept their promise to the fire. Outside, the snow fell endlessly, erasing footprints, but not memory. Inside, the air never cooled. The house would stand for decades more long after both Jack and Bear were gone. A quiet refuge at the edge of the valley, and the people who passed it would still call it what it had always been. The house that never froze. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe for more true tales of warmth and courage. Which moment stayed with you most, the storm, the rescue, or the silence after? Tell us where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel.